Well, good evening and welcome to the BJCP study group. John Mallet will be with us shortly. The cold, I guess, has created some computer issues on his end. We want to blame it on that anyway. So hopefully John will be up momentarily. I'm going to be checking the screen as I look for him. So I'll be a little bit distracted until I get him up on screen. Let's see. No, still not live yet. Okay. So I've got to kind of watch that. Anyway, I'm glad to have you on board this evening, this very cold evening, or at least for those of us on the East Coast. That excludes our friends in Florida. I see we've had a couple of folks there in Florida. I know your weather's a bit more pleasant. John had said this morning was minus 17 degrees in Kalamazoo. So that's pretty serious cold. Greenville, South Carolina, where I'm from, I think we hit 21 maybe was our low, and it warmed up maybe to the middle 40s today. So really quite pleasant. We do have on screen, I think, although it may have disappeared here. Yeah, there it is. We are going to be talking about a Guinness Stout, and my beer cam has decided to go out of focus. There we go. Well, it's going to float in and out. But anyway, you get an idea. We have a Guinness Foreign Extra Stout. We will be talking about that, and John's going to kind of lead into the webinar with that momentarily. So again, I'm working with John right now and trying to get him up on screen, and so we will hopefully have a little luck with that in just a moment. While we're waiting on John, let me kind of walk you through some of the screens that we've got, and then we can jump right into the webinar when I see John jump up there on screen. And again, I've got to watch for him. All right. So we have a couple of things going on. First of all, we are going to talk about a Guinness Foreign Extra Stout, and John's going to kind of unpack that for us. And I do appreciate you joining me today, and as we grow not only our beer skills, but apparently today some of our technical skills. We also just wanted to let you know that down here at the bottom of the screen, we've got quite a few options. If this is the first time that you've ever used Crowdcast, there is an option right there in the center to join our BJCP study group. There's John, I hope. So our BJCP study group, just to the right of that is an ask a question field.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
I do hear you. That's a big improvement.
Let's see here.
I was just telling John, I'll keep talking. So we have asked the question down there, and it looks like we've got 13 questions already.
Here.
So that's going to be cool.
Join BJCP.
Yeah, you don't need to worry about that one. And also that the chat screen, I see everybody's kind of getting the hang of the chat screen. I would just encourage you to use that kind of.
Mute mic, disable camera, flip camera, leave screen.
Share where you're from. John, we are live, by the way.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me. That's not good. Anyway, we'll continue on. Everybody's saying they can hear you, John. Let's see. We can hear you.
All right. I can't hear you, but hey, whatever, you know. This is just all right. had quite a day. I wanted to since I can't hear you, I'm just going to talk and wait for my computer to finish updating, which it determined it needed to do desperately just before. So, Doug, I'm going to give you a minute if you want to. I assume maybe you've introduced me. Do you want me to? You can just nod or whatever. Tell me, do we want to drink beer right now? Because I'm about ready to start drinking something beyond that.
I think it's time for a beer. This is a rough start, and it's cold.
Okay, and again, I can't hear you, so this is I'm operating from my cell phone right now. It's goofy as hell. Well, all right. Well, I guess I could probably get started. I'm gonna grab the beer that we wanted to taste today, which is Guinness Extra Stout. And let me see if I can grab this right here. Oh, look at that. Little Guinness Extra Stout. Let me get my glass. And I see some names up there on the screen that are familiar. It's great to hear you all. I'll tell you that today in Michigan, when I left my house, it was like 17 degrees out, so it's effing cold. So with that, the beer that I chose today was this Guinness Extra Stout. As I was talking to Doug in preparation for this, it's my understanding that there's quite a few members who are from outside of the country, and you would thought, it'd be great to drink a nice Bell's beer, but Bell's beer is not available everywhere in the U.S. and certainly not worldwide. We are a pretty big exporting brewery. We go all the way to Puerto Rico, and we go through many states, but not all. So I thought, Guinness Foreign Extra Stout, it's a real classic, and it's a beer that's really drives on malt flavors, and then some other interesting flavors that we'll talk about later as well. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour this beer into this mouth, but first I'm going to put it into this glass. So there we go. So as I start to pour it, you see it starts to pour a really nice thick foam to it.
Well, that's a serious
this beer is different than the nitrogenated versions, although you can see it still builds a really nice foam to it. And I think that foam is important because it's one of the things that malt helps to drive, that malt's really quite responsible for. So with that, I'm pouring the glass in there. I'm taking a look at it first visually. It's just an absolutely beautiful beer. It's got a sort of darkish hue to the foam itself. Oh, and it's got a really nice sort of clean yeast character to it. Some light malt, sort of light dark malt flavors, a little bit of coffee or chocolate, and then like just a beautiful kind of character to it. Excuse me. I pick up a little bit, if I kind of work backwards, right now what's happened in my mouth that when I first put it in there, it's not like an overbearingly sweet beer. It's a pretty neutral beer. It's got some nice malt flavors, and the malt flavors that it really exemplifies at the completion of drinking, we get these really nice sort of like ashy like character, the characteristic sort of ash flavor to it. And that is because that the malt and the barley that are used in this have been roasted to such a high degree that we've nearly incinerated them. And with that near incineration comes a removal of a lot of the flavor. So although we get that nice ash character, we don't have a lot of the kind of caramel flavors. We don't have a ton of the real sweet malt or biscuit flavors. We don't have a lot of just straight sweetness that we would taste if we were just making a straight wort, an unfermented beer. Okay. All right. That's pretty good. I'm enjoying that quite a bit. Woo. All right.
So, John, I don't think...
Is that good? Should I talk more about this? Nod your head, Doug. I can see you. This is just the goofiest thing I've ever done. Usually I love presenting, and I do it fairly often. And being on a platform where suddenly nothing's working, where suddenly nothing's working is is certainly a challenge. I'm just kind of rearranging all my power here to try to get this situation resolved.
So,
right, let's see here.
While John is doing that,
oh,
we will continue on. So please hang in there. There've been some some serious technical issues.
I have no idea why I can't hear a thing through this, but hey, whatever.
So we will eventually get into and start to cover the questions from T15, discuss the role of malt and yeast in beer characteristics. John had specifically chosen the Guinness Extra Stout, Foreign Extra Stout, because he felt like it exemplified a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about that requires malt. So, John, we are hearing you, but I guess you're not hearing us.
Was that like? I'm sorry, I couldn't see that, Doug.
Oh, yeah.
It's like super tiny. Let's see here. Oh, we can hear you. Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, well, maybe I'll just start talking about malt. Well, to kind of give you some stuff. I had a nice little PowerPoint. Maybe it'll come up soon. I'll be able to get on it. But until then, let's talk about malt. And specifically, what we're talking about today are some of the questions associated with the BJCP. And, when I think about the questions that are there, we really want to think about, what is malt? What is malt and how does that impact beer and beer flavor? So if I think about malt, malting has been going on for a long time. Interestingly, malt actually predates the advent or the growth of wheat. Wheat as a variety did not actually arise until after people had been making malt. People, the sort of hunter-gatherers, moving through the landscape, found these ample grains, things like rye and some of the proto-wheats, and began to harvest them and eat them. And these were, fairly small. They're not improved like they are today, like nice, plump, big kernels, but were pretty small. And at some point, somebody figured out that, if we take these grains and we allow them to turn them into gruel, or if we allow them to rest for a while and then dry them out, that we get some pretty nice flavors and even nicer effects in that the grain begins to produce alcohol. And, physically what's happening there is that the grain is a seed. I think about that barley kernel as being a lot like an egg. There's an outer shell, the husk. There's a young embryo inside of that, encased inside that husk. And then there's these ample energy reserves in the form of starches. And what starches look like at sort of a molecular level are long chains of sugars. So sugar is a 6 carbon, 6 oxygen, 12 hydrogen molecule. And if we string them together, sort of like a sugar linked to a sugar linked to a sugar in these long chains, that's starch, and that's the way the grain reserves energy inside of there. That is not digestible in its native form by people. We need to chew that up, and the enzymes in our mouth break that down into sugars, which we then can assimilate. And that's a similar situation for yeast. Yeast cannot eat long chains of these carbohydrates, but needs to be broken down to simple sugars. And the process, your sound input source, it may not be the headphone jack, is not selected for this application. Well, thanks, Ken. I'm actually on right now I'm on my iPhone, perched up on front of my computer, which was rebooting for whatever, who the hell knows what reason. But so these long chains of sugars, we want to break them down. And the way that those get broken down is the process of malting. In nature, the grain is going to use those energy reserves to fuel that embryo, to fuel the young plant growth. And enzymes, which are naturally present in there, are going to facilitate that. And malting is really manipulating those enzymes to break down the starches into sugars and to make those energies available to get into wort. So we have not only a conversion, but also an accessibility that needs to be addressed. So how does that work? Well, the process of malting is really 3 steps. It is steeping, it is germination, and it's kilning. And we'll go into each of these for just a second. Steeping is just simply putting grain into water and allowing it to stand for a couple of days. Oftentimes in the malt house, there'll be a few water changes. And really what this is doing is mimicking when the spring rains come and soak down that barley kernel. Soak down that barley kernel, and that's what initiates this growth process. The next phase is germination. And in commercial malting, presently in the United States, that germination phase lasts roughly 4 days. And during this phase, the grain is allowed to grow. And as that grain starts to grow, it sends out rootlets, and it also begins to grow the acrospire, what would be the stalk of the plant. And that acrospire starts to grow up inside of the kernel and eventually poke its way out. And as that acrospire makes its way under the husk of the barley, this is roughly attuned with the enzymatic changes occurring in the endosperm. At some point, if we just allowed this to grow, we would get a couple things happening. One, we would get this matted mass of grain, that the sort of the little rootlets would tangle together, and the eventual acrospires would tangle together, and it would just form this impenetrable mat. It would also smother itself, kill itself, and end up with horrible putrefying flavors. And the last thing is, if we allowed it to go to completion, then all of the energy reserves would be used up. So in malting, the kilning stage is really used to halt that process. Now, that process, that termination of germination, the halting of germination, occurs with kilning, with drying it out. And when when we dry that out, they're put into large beds, and air is blown through it. And as that air blows through the grain, it's removing moisture. We want to use some heated air because it's got a greater carrying capacity for removing moisture. And it also causes flavor changes within the barley kernel. So if we take the same barley, we can treat it different ways. We could allow it to germinate for longer or slower. We could, change the temperature of that. So we have time, we have temperature. We have airflow through there that could be changed. We could change the amount of water that was used initially, how much hydration it would get. But in the end, we end up with a germinated kernel. During the kilning step, we can vary the time, the temperature, and the humidity at which that grain is dried out. Now, the way that this works is if we just built we took a screen door and we put a screen door over a fire and spread some malt on there, then that would dry out. The convection of air rising off of the fire and flowing through the malt would dry it away. Within the malt house, we have the ability to take that air and recirculate it. So bring that moist air back in and move it through there. And what this causes is this will cause changes in color and flavor inside the malt. So going through with a base malt, a white malt, as the British call it, just for Americans, we might just call it brewer's malt. Really what we're trying to do is to put in the so the minimum amount of heat required to dry it out so that we don't get color development. And at the same time, we're also trying to minimize the impact to enzymes which are naturally formed inside that barley kernel. When we increase the heat, we're going to increase color. And it's a lot of the similar reactions and pathways that occur with taking a pale piece of bread and turning it into toast. We could gently warm the bread. We could toast the bread so we get a nice sort of golden color, or we could nearly incinerate it. And so when I think about malt, there's really a few, there's many types of malt, but there are really a few categories of malt or families that everything falls into. So the first is, what are the first type of malt, which we might call base malt or two-row brewer's pale, or whatever that's called at your local store, is that minimal heat input and drying temperature. Beyond that, we could take that same malt and at the end of that kilning sequence, raise the temperature up. And as we raise the temperature up, then these sort of golden colors start to develop. I think about some of the flavors that we get from a Munich malt. A Munich malt is a sort of high dried or kiln malt where we allow the temperature to rise up and we get some of these great flavors. The next thing we could do would be to take the barley at its fully germinated state and begin to circulate warm, moist air around it, and recirculate that warm, that warm, moist air. And what will happen inside the kernel is that the enzymatic conversion that we eventually will get in the mash tun occurs inside the kernel. So in a lot of ways, we're mashing in the husk. What will occur then is these long chains of starches are broken down into sugars, and the sugars will then combine with the amino acids that sort of protein fragments that are just present in barley. And this combination kicks off a set of reactions called Maillard reactions. And those Maillard reactions are responsible for a ton of flavor and also color development. So a classic example of this would be a caramel malt. And think about, something like, one of my favorite caramel malts, one that we really just absolutely adore using at the brewery, is Simpson's 5060. And to me, this just encompasses these great sort of caramel flavors, really just absolutely lovely. So Tom is saying, so that mashing in the husk behind the creation of crystal caramel malts. Absolutely, Tom. What's happening inside of there is those enzymes breaking down the starches into sugars, and then as more heat is added, those sugars are combining under warm, moist conditions with amino acids, protein fragments, to form these Maillard reaction products. And again, I just think of that great sort of biscuity character that you get. And I think about like sort of a crackery, biscuity thing, maybe like what are they? Those airplane crackers, the Bischoffs. There's some of that flavor that's going on there. Those things are pretty sweet, but they also have that flavor. I also think of the great flavors that we get from sort of like a Triscuit or something like that. Some of these flavors to me are just are wonderful malt characters. And then the third or the fourth broad family of malt. So we've got our pale or white malt. We have our high dried malt like Munich. We have a caramel malt or crystal malt, and those are really sort of the same family. The last one is the roasted malts. And for these, we can take white malt and put it inside of a roasting drum, sort of think like a coffee roaster, and tumble them around with heat. And during that heating phase, we now begin to like toast them, and they become quite black. With some of them, we go up in color the longer and hotter we get. So we might start out with something that's fairly dark brown, move into a really dark brown, like a chocolate malt, and eventually you get to a black malt. And that black malt is really what's responsible for making a beer like this. And we know that we make stouts that we don't need to use that much black malt to really impart that color, to get that super darkness in there. That's so drinkable. I like that beer a lot. So So we've got these, these quite dark kind of characteristics, colors that we're developing, and that 500 Lovibond. I mean, you think about it, that's 250 times the color impact of a similar, very pale malt. Not a lot of fermentable extract in there, pretty much nothing. And when they're producing it, it's pretty close to the temperature that spontaneous combustion would occur. So it can be kind of a dangerous. Dangerous. I guess you're on the thin edge there. So those are some of the flavors that we're really getting out of malt. I also think about some of the off flavors that would be associated with malt. So what could you get? If I'm thinking about judging beers, tasting beers, what doesn't work? Well, I think a careful hand is important. That if you are overloading it with something like black malt, then clearly you're going to get these really overly astringent characteristics to it. So that's a pretty simple one. I remember back years ago when I first started judging beer, it seemed like everybody was using some carapils, and they thought, oh, some carapils good, more better, and you would get just this real characteristic kind of off, almost, for me it was almost like soapy kind of character to the malt. Other flavors that we could get from malt, certainly sort of a tannic or astringent characteristic. That can be a result of really beating up husk and allowing the components, the tannins in there to leach into the grain. Certainly we know that water chemistry is really important for minimizing this. That water chemistry can, if we get into some higher pH stuff, it's going to selectively pull those into solution, and that's going to give us bad results. Other flavors we can get from malt. So the malt, has got a lot of the precursor for DMS, dimethyl sulfide, that kind of cooked cabbage character to it. And that DMS precursor, S-methylmethionine, is actually degraded at warmer temperatures. So when we get into traditional malting practices for English malts, we start to destroy that S-methylmethionine, which then removes the ability for that malt to throw a DMS character. If we want to make a very pale beer, then we want to use pale malts, and those very pale malts don't go through those. You can't go through those temperatures, and so therefore we need to do something different with that. And the basis of controlling that DMS in the final beer is a great kettle boil. It is the conversion and removal, it's like vapor distillation, is what's going to pull it out of there. So if we're smelling, in this sort of cooked cabbage character in a beer, we know that number one, that the malts that were used had this precursor in it, and then number two, that it was not effectively removed in the kettle boil. So good rolling kettle boil for ample time is what's going to get it out of there. We can't boil pale beers endlessly because they do pick up color. I think about the color that we get in pale American lager beer, like a majority of that color is actually developed in the kettle. So the wort that comes in is quite pale, and then picks up color and exits as still a pretty pale beer. So those are some of the off flavors that I associate with malt. Let me think here. Doug, how we doing on time here? We doing okay? All right, great.
Doing great.
Okay, so if we thought about list 4 distinct beer styles associated with malts. So for me, if we look at those 4 different characteristic malts, we've got our base malt. For me, this is a Pilsner malt, and therefore a Pilsner beer is going to exemplify it. Think about the flavors that we'll get in a classic Czech Pils. There might be a small amount of that DMS that sits in there, and it's interesting that, but in England, that DMS character is actually positively associated with lager beers. They want a little bit of it in there. It gives sort of a grassiness. It gives, just what they would, one of the flavors that they would associate with malt. The next type I think about would be a kiln malt, a high-dried malt. So Munich malt, and for me, the absolute epitome of that is an Oktoberfest, a fest beer. And, like sort of a traditional Vienna to Oktoberfest. In that spectrum, it gets this wonderful, wonderful sort of, to me, what maltiness is. I think that is absolutely associated with that style. The next would be a caramel malt. I think about caramel malt as being amber beers, something with complementary, not overwhelming hop character. Certainly you can have some hops in there, but for that malt to really shine through, it needs to balance and play a secondary role. And so for me, an American amber, like the Bell's Amber for me, with that awesome Simpsons 50/60, really shows off, what that malt in the relationship. Slightly caramely, just round and rich, full. That to me is what that is. And then the last type are the roasted malts. These very high dried. So that's anything in the porter or stout category, and certainly the beer that we're drinking right now has got that. Interestingly, with regular Guinness Draft, a lot of that color is not coming from roasted malt, but just roasted barley. So in the same way that we've taken this white malt, this pale malt, and then put it through a coffee drum like roaster, we can do that same thing with unmalted barley and get that same characteristic. The very white head that's associated with Guinness, that to me is a sign of what's happening there. The browner color here, that to me shows that there's a little bit of the malting presence during that kilning. Okay, and I will tell you that I am so over right now technology. I mean, I use it every day and I love it. For whatever reason, when it screws up, kind of screws up my world. So apologize for being rattled. Okay. Yeah, my PC is not even firing up right now for some reason. It's just ridiculous. Well, I'll tell you a funny thing that, today we've had, exceptionally cold weather in the upper Midwest, where, this polar vortex has come down. It's just been like beautifully cold. I was out skiing the other night. It was great, but it's really cold. And then yesterday in the middle of the day, we've got word that in Michigan, the gas compressor station, which carries like 64% of the energy in the state, caught fire and burned up. And this is like a huge thing. So the state contacted us. They contacted Ford. They contacted something like 80 businesses and said, "Is it possible that you could cease production? We're asking you to cease production until we can get this straightened out, so that we have enough gas to keep everybody warm." And so we were dealing with that. That was an event. And then the last thing that was going on is we have spent grain at the brewery, and the spent grain goes out into this area with a silo, and then the farmer comes by and picks it up. Well, the bottom of that thing just froze solid. We have got heaters on there, so it's like kind of like an obstructed, pooper there. So we had to get that. So right now we've got gas again. We're passing spent grain. Everything's good there. I get a dead computer. This is small stuff. I'm talking on my phone. I'm just really happy that I'm here doing any of it, and happy that I'm drinking a beer with y'all. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about is yeast. Yeast is it does the work at the brewery. We just kind of set the table. We try and set the table so that the party can happen, and then the yeast bring that party, and it does a great job. So yeast, single-celled microorganism that's going to eat those, consume those carbohydrates in the form of sugars and create from it carbon dioxide and alcohol. And if we think about the sugar unit as being a Have another beer, John. You've earned it. Okay, if you insist. I'm just gonna figure out where my bottle opener is. Oh, there it is. So that yeast is going to consume those sugars. Those sugars again are a 6 carbon, 6 oxygen, 12 hydrogen package, and stoichiometrically, if we take that sugar and break it apart, we can break it up to produce one alcohol, which has 2 carbons, 6 hydrogens, and an oxygen, and also 2 carbon dioxide. So C, 1 carbon and 2 oxygens. And the masses of those are somewhat similar, so that if we took 100 grams of sugar and fermented it out, we would get roughly 50 grams of alcohol and 50 grams of CO2. So yeast, taxonomically falls into a couple of different categories. For a long time, for most of human history, there's been not pure cultures, but the predominant yeast that's been involved with beer making is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, ale yeast. And within that family, over time, it has diverged into a bunch of different strains. This is the same stuff that is used for fermenting breads. And we're not harnessing the alcohol component, we're harnessing the carbon dioxide component. I think about how much carbon dioxide is released in fermentation, it's quite a bit. If you took a gallon or a liter, say, of 12 Plato wort and you fermented it, it would create carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide, as a gas, occupies more volume for weight. But that volume of that would be somewhere in the range of like 22 liters of carbon dioxide if you measured it at sort of standard temperature and pressure. So there's a lot of CO2 that's generated, and that's what's being harnessed to make bread and cause that bread to rise. There are other types of yeasts out there, and we're certainly familiar with Brettanomyces, the British yeast. And Brettanomyces was identified in a Belgian beer originally, and was said, hey, this is the yeast of Britain. So Brettanomyces, the British yeast, has got some different characteristics. It produces different flavors, and it can utilize different carbohydrates through a divergent pathway. There's also another type of yeast, which is sometimes called Vivarium or Pasteurinatus, and really this is a hybridized yeast. The lager yeasts are hybridized. So there was a yeast which is known as Baianus, and has been discovered living in like the galls of oak trees in Patagonia, and it appears that this yeast hybridized with that of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, ale yeast, to produce lager yeast. And the lager yeast is interesting because it is able to assimilate a different set of sugars, and also is able to operate at much lower temperatures. That yeast, I think broadly of ales and lagers, and if I was going to make a broad generalization, I say ales are wow, that produce these great sort of estery, fruity characteristics, can be quite flavorful, and lagers are more these very smooth, delicate, more sulfur-driven characteristics, which are often are often present. So broadly, we have ale yeast, we have lager yeast, and then we've got these other yeasts, these wild yeasts that are also out there, and Brettanomyces is among them. So what does Brett do that's different than those? Let's back up. So for ale yeast has a pretty easy time assimilating 1 and 2 sugar chains. So again, when we think about those long chains of carbohydrates that start out in malt and are broken down into maybe 1 or 2 or maybe 3 sugar units, then ale would be able to process anything with 1 or 2 sugar units, but doesn't have the capability to break down anything beyond that. Lager yeast is able to break down maltotriose. So this is a 3-sugar or a 3 sugar chain, and it's able to bring that in, and then it stops as well. Interestingly, with some of the wild yeasts, they are able to produce enzymes which break down longer chain carbohydrates into something assimilable. So how does that manifest itself? When I'm drinking a beer like Orval, Orval I think is just absolutely brilliant. It is, as a brewery, we need to make a lot of different wort strains. We make one wort strain to make stout. We make another wort strain to make Oberon. We make another wort strain to make amber. And so all of these wort strains individually to make the beers that we make. For me, Orval makes a couple of different beers, and they do it all in one wort stream. And the way that manifests itself is that Orval, when it's first bottled, is young, and there's some sweetness in there. And over time, there's Brettanomyces in Orval, and over time, as that beer matures, then those longer chain sugars are broken down and consumed, and the beer becomes drier, and it becomes more, I don't know, I just love the character of it. I'm having a hard time, saying what I'm saying right now, but I just think about the delicate sort of almost pineapple-like esters that are created in that secondary fermentation or that tertiary fermentation that's occurring with Brettanomyces. So Brettanomyces has these exogenous enzymes. The other thing it'll do is it will create more carbon dioxide and raises the carbonation level, which in turn drops the pH, and which enhances that really beautiful dry characteristics in the beer. With yeast, if we're looking at strains, beyond strains, we've also got some great ways to manipulate flavors inside of. So the question is does Orval intentionally add Brett when they package or in the secondary? Yes, they do. They do put Brett in. They mix it in prior to packaging, and it's a pretty small amount of it. And that's really a characteristic of what happens inside of Orval. Hold on 1 second. I'm just gonna swear or stomp my feet or something.
Okay, while John is doing that, I appreciate everybody hanging in there. We will continue on, and I think John's about to wrap up the more formal part of this, but I think we still will be able to answer the questions, because it'll be just a matter of going through the questions. So I see we've got 17 questions.
I might be selling a computer real cheap here. There we go. All right. Okay. Sorry about that.
Keep going.
So Orval's kind of got this wonderful characteristic, and the other things that we can do to manipulate yeast flavors beyond just strain selection include what temperature are we fermenting it at. So, in general, the warmer we ferment, the more sort of fruity, estery characteristics we're going to get with it. So if we think about where beers want, or where different. Is cameraman your second job, John? Yeah. So sort of where different yeasts want to ferment. Lager yeasts want to ferment at slightly colder temperatures. Ales are more moderate. We think about something in the 48 to 50s, 52 range in Fahrenheit for lager beers. For ales, we're up somewhere in the 66 to 70 degrees is a great temperature for many ale yeast to be going on. Some of the saison yeast want to be fermenting hotter than that, and then things like Kveik, this Norwegian yeast, that the stuff is fermenting at very warm temperatures. If we take those same yeasts, if we take something like a lager yeast and we ferment it at warm temperatures, we're going to start to get a very different flavor characteristics. The classic example of this would be this is steam beer. Anchor Steam from San Francisco, California, these beers were fermented warm, and they get some much more fruity characteristics than that yeast would produce at more normal lager temperatures. Next thing that we have that we can control with yeast is pitching rate, addition rate. How much yeast do we start to ferment with? So if the yeast is if you put very little yeast in a beer, then it's going to multiply many, many times. And as it multiplies many times, then you're going to express different characteristics. I think about something like Weizen beer really exemplifies, Hefeweizen really exemplifies some of these characteristics. Weizen beer is utilizing a strain that is an ale strain, but it's sort of divergent from the American strains that we're used to, and it wants to throw sort of phenolic character to it. Sometimes in brewery circles, this is called POF, or phenolic off flavor. Personally, I love phenolic flavors. Belgian strains and the Hefeweizen strains, this is what really exemplifies those. And again, I just love these characteristics. And beyond that, again, if we're pitching yeast at varying levels, then we're going to get different flavors out of there. Yeast growth is associated with esters, and so therefore under pitching or over pitching will change the beer. To me, this is a real area of opportunity for many homebrewers. And if we're judging beers in the BJCO beer judge certification program, then good yeast control is a real area that one could be aware of. For the most part, I find many homebrew examples to be under-pitched, so not sufficient yeast. And I'll tell you, at our brewery, we are very particular, very careful with how much yeast we're putting in there, that it's known and it's consistent. And that's not always the case if if you're using like Smack Pack or you don't have that the visibility into there. So I think about that's another place. Another thing that I look at with yeast is aeration. So how did we do getting air into the wort? Oxygen is absolutely essential for yeast health. Yeast is metabolizing oxygen to produce sterols, which make the outer cell wall flexible. And if we do not provide sufficient oxygen, then that yeast can become have a difficult time uptaking nutrients. So slow and lagging ferments at the end of the ferment cycle can be a problem, and the sort of flavors associated with it. If I think about how do these things manifest themselves, what are some of the flavors that we get associated with fermentation? We also have off flavors. So one of those off flavors that we may have is a green apple characteristic. This is acetaldehyde. And really, acetaldehyde is generated early in fermentation and then reuptaken later. So acetaldehyde is a major component or a major reason why we mature beers, why we lager beers, is to allow the uptake of that acetaldehyde characteristic. A second fermentation-derived common off flavor is diacetyl and the associated vicinal diketone 2,3-pentanedione. And these are sort of the buttery or butterscotch characteristics. And what's happening is that how these arise is that it has to do with uptake and synthesis of amino acids by the yeast. So these amino acids are utilized by the yeast to build additional yeast, and the sort of valine, leucine, these sorts of things. So diacetyl is a result of a precursor, which is called alpha acetolactate, and that alpha acetolactate is generated by yeast and put out into the ferment, and as it goes out into the beer, eventually it's going to be reuptaken. And I've often likened this to the way that so if you had if you had like a 7-year-old kid party, and you put out a bunch of pizza, then the kids all run in and they pick up a piece of pizza and they eat the easily assimilable part, the cheesy part, and they throw the pizza bones, the crust, back on the plate, and then they go outside and they play. And eventually, when they're hungry enough, they're going to come back in, and at that point, they're going to uptake that component, the pizza crust. And in a similar way, the yeast is going to uptake that alpha-acetolactate. That alpha-acetolactate will also spontaneously oxidize into diacetyl. So good fermentation control allows for the reuptake of this alpha-acetolactate and processing into something that then does not manifest itself as diacetyl. In a commercial brewery, we may make beer that does not smell like diacetyl, put it in a package, and later it will spontaneously convert. We've got the instrumentation and the knowledge that that we're able to have visibility into that, and don't do that. But that's not tools that are available to everybody on homebrewing. All right. So Jeff Rankert says, your thoughts on open fermented lagers, Schonram and others, strain dependent? I like Schonram. That's good. That's good brewery. Let me go through a couple of these other sort of off flavors, and then we'll get into that. So dimethyl sulfide, obviously that sits out there. That this is the yeast will convert the precursor DMSO into dimethyl sulfide or S-methylmethionine. I'm sorry, DMS out. So that's something to be considered. I think about lager beers as often being sulfury. And that sulfur could be hydrogen sulfide, H2S, or SO2. And the SO2 is sort of like that aroma that you get when you blow out a match. That sort of sulfury. The SO2 is more like rotten eggs. These have everything to do with proper yeast health and proper yeast functioning. And an important component to managing a fermentation is knowing when to get rid of that yeast. After we go through fermentation and the yeast begins to fall out of solution, eventually that yeast will start to die. It will start to autolyze and sort of spill its guts. And the aromas associated with yeast degradation and cellular death are sort of a goaty character. So this is like caprylic and caproic acid are two of the components there, this sort of like goaty characteristic. Okay, so those are some of the some of the off flavors associated with beers. Talking about Jeff's question here about open fermented lagers. Goatee. So what is goaty? So goaty is the smell of goat. Like the animal. Yeah, which sometimes sometimes the Bach has a little goatee. So I guess it could be a goat with a goatee, smelling goatee.
Had to ask.
Okay, so open fermented lagers, absolutely wonderful. One of the slides I had for you was that this last weekend I was out in California at the Hop Growers Convention, and the Hop Quality Group, which is an organization that absolutely love working with and help to found. We met, and afterwards I had the chance to go up with my great friends Vinny and Natalie Chiluzzo up to their new Russian River Brewery. So Russian River, nice brewery, always made great beers. They've recently put in a new brewery in Windsor, California, and it's just beautiful. I mean, it's sort of to the style, or not the style, but to the quality levels that synonymous with going to Sierra Nevada, going to New Glarus, are sitting out there. And while I was there, one of the things that they were super proud to show was these open fermenters, and they were fermenting. One of their beers that was in there is the STS Pils, which is their wonderful Pilsner beer, just absolutely lovely. They're fermenting it in open fermenters. And I think about what do open fermenters do? Like, what are the flavors that you get from there? for me, the open fermenters really help to, for one, just the fact that the brewer can walk in and look and see the ferment. And I think that anybody who's home brewing knows, as you look through that carboy or look through that plastic fermentation, that's a translucent fermentation bucket, and you can see, how's my ferment doing? Is it doing well? As a brewer, I absolutely love that. We've got, sort of glass hatches in our 2 hardened fermenters, so we can see that. There's just something so awesome about that. To be able to know, even before you take a sample analytically, like, how's it doing? The second thing that it's doing is with the way those fermenters are set up there, is they've got some spillover, and sort of some of that schaum or some of the rocky heads are able to be skimmed off and cleaned out. And I just love seeing those either hop tannins or whatever else being removed in a way that makes it pretty effective to make this smooth, clean beer. So in terms of oxygen transport or something like this, I don't think it's particularly a factor. I do think that something that's kind of important with fermentation, though, are the kinetics inside the fermenter. And if you've got this wider and shallower fermenter, which is often the case with open fermenters, then for some reason it just feels like the beer is a little softer. If you've got a very deep and narrow fermenter, then the generation of carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide, we said there's a lot of carbon dioxide created during fermentation, that as it drives up, those bubbles rising up through, there is a selection of aromatic components which want to be in gas, not in liquid. And so those sort of climb into the bubbles as they go up. And then pop and are removed. This changes the ferment. There were some at one point the realization was made that you could ferment beer faster if you stirred it. And although it was fermented faster, my sense is that beer was not superior. That basically the better beer took time. And those breweries that embarked on that stirred ferment, was not particularly positive. Okay, we have 18 questions. You want to try? Yeah, we can. I can answer them. I'd love to try. Let's go. I got like another 4 beers. So
you'll have
down
to
here, say something nice. You're gonna type them in. I can't. The only thing I can see is the comments coming along the side.
I'll do that. Hang on.
Let's see here.
All right. Hang on.
Nice. No. Can you type? Could you cut and paste them in the comments? Okay. How's the best way to store malts? I'm a home brewer and I buy 50 pounds at a time, but it takes many months to go through. Are sealed 5-gallon pails a good idea? Any other recommendations? Okay. So malt's actually fairly storable. The main enemies from malts are that you want to prevent it from getting moist. So malt, as it comes out of the kiln, is it's got a fairly low moisture content, somewhere like in the 5-6 range. So if you can get something that's sealable and airtight, then that would be important. I would keep the temperature moderate or even cold, and obviously keep it dry, keep it away from smelly stuff. So. Again, I was in a Swiss brewery at one point, and the Swiss brewery legally had to store a year's worth of malt, and the beers weren't bad. It had to do with, I think, them losing production capabilities in World War I, and there was a mandate for that. So, let's see here. Let's see. Okay, so is that a softness circulation thing? Maybe conicals designed to circulate the fermenting beer, rectangular dish tub or whatever, are going to have dead spots in the corners. I think that if I think about like a large brewery fermenter, those can be they could be 80 feet tall. There's a couple of things that happen there. One is if you've got a column of beer that's 80 feet deep, then the pressure at the bottom of that is going upwards of 3 atmospheres. And when you get those higher pressures, then there is a greater amount of carbon dioxide that's able to be retained in that section. That greater amount of carbon dioxide is toxic to yeast in higher concentrations, so it just adds more stress to it. Secondly, when you're at that deep and a bubble starts to form, it starts to turn that fermenter over, and it's dragging with the bubble as it rises. It's dragging beer up through there, and that churn, sort of can remove beer aromas, delicate beer aromas. Excuse me. I believe is sort of the way I think about that. Okay. Next question. Do Belgian Pilsner and German Pilsner's malts differ in flavor? If so, is it due to the barley variety or malting? At times I've interchanged them and haven't noticed a difference, but they have never brewed side-by-side beers for comparison. So in terms of, Belgian versus German Pilsner malts, really what we're talking about is a location, and that location may have at one point influenced the raw materials. At this point in Europe, the varieties that are being grown are similar. A lot of barley grown in Denmark or France or in Germany or wherever. Those growing conditions are pretty similar, and the malting barley varieties are similar. I would say the place where you start to differ a little more in growing conditions might be in coastal England. So you've got this, moist and moderate temperature. Versus something inside the continent where it can be warmer and drier. The malting practice for either the Germans or the Belgians, if they're looking to make a Pilsner malt, they want to make something that's very pale. So they will utilize the skills of the malter, the levers that the maltster can use there are attempting to keep moistures down at the end of germination, to have very moderate temperatures as the moisture is removed during kilning. Beyond that, the final curing temperature, there might be some differences there, but there's nothing that says that in the sort of the Belgian brewing practice that says we need to have these higher temperatures. Certainly, the German maltsters will utilize a wide variety of we'll use a wide variety of kilning regimes to produce different malts. Very traditional Czech Pilsner malt was done with pretty low moistures, and that really helped to manage it. They were also sort of under modified. The Germans, to a greater extent than certainly the British, preferred under modified malts years ago, and that is in large part what drove decoction mashing, because the malts were under modified, they were not fully converted. They needed to take some extra steps in the brew house to bring those flavors forward. So, all right. So, what's the best way to evaluate your malt that you've been storing a while? You believe you've kept it dry, but it still has age, and you hate to waste it. So I think the best way to assess this is, if I think about what malt happens to malt, is malt becomes slack. Slack malt is malt that has picked up moisture, and we can assess that using a variety of different equipment, including your mouth. So simply taking a hand, like some malt, and putting it in your mouth and chewing it. Does it have sort of a snap to it? Does it break apart, or is it kind of almost mushy? And you could think about that. You could see the effects of higher moisture in malt by just taking a little bit of malt. The next time you're brewing, take a little bit in a tiny bowl and throw a little water in there and kind of stir it around and just let it sit. I mean, you're just sprinkling it on there, and you'll notice that it becomes a little softer. And almost gummier, like it doesn't have that snap. So that's a good way to do it. I think that the problem with storing malt with moisture in it is that it can become musty, moldy, and have those characteristics. And that's really, what we're looking to prevent, is those having those flavors arise. So. Can you compare and contrast some of the malt tasting methods out there? The chew test, the malt teas, do you have a recommended method? So I always like to chew malts, and I just think it gives, a pretty good idea of what the flavors that are contained in there are. I also feel like there's a nice technique if you were to Google the hot steep method. This is a method that was developed by this awesome sensory scientist out at Breeze named Cassie. There's another person, the two other people who are heavily involved with this. Great friends Lindsay Barr, who's out at New Belgium, and also Andrea Stanley at Valley Malt. And what they've developed is an ASBC, an American Society of Brewing Chemists, recognized method where a malt sample is ground and then is steeped in water and then filtered through, coffee filter, and then tasting that tea. I think that Lindsay and Cassie are excellent scientists, sensory scientists, and they've validated that this is a method that is repeatable and robust. And for those reasons, I really strongly recommend that hot steep method. I do like chewing malt though, and I think it does give you all a lot of information about what that's doing. One of the things I like to do is to take the malt blend. If I've got a prospective malt blend, I want to make X beer, and to make a representative sample of that malt blend and then chew that. I think that gives some good information. What do they taste like together? Because ultimately they're all going to be put together. Okay, so what are some pros and cons of using a decoction mash process versus a simple infusion mash with longer boiling of the entire wort in order to produce a fuller malt and Maillard character? Okay, so originally, if I think about so two broad schools of brewing, the sort of the English ale brewing, and then continental lagers, English or Czech. The outcomes of those beers are, to me, related to the malting practice that was followed. So in England, those barleys were grown in a maritime environment. They were malted, fully modified. They were, there's a bunch of modification that occurs there. And so these are very easily digestible or processable in the mash. The brew house equipment that therefore is used can be very simple. A simple infusion mash in England with these malts produces good extract that's free-flowing. We contrast that with what was happening in the continent, and there the malts were not as fully modified. So the germination did not go for as long. There was more starch in there, but it's potential and it's kind of locked up. And there would be lower enzymatic quantities in some of these. So the decoction mashing, you would take that under-modified barley or the under-modified malt, you would crush it and mix it with water and then heat it, and you're really trying to bring it through all of these optimal enzymatic windows so that it can those enzymes can do their job fully. There is both a conversion of starches to sugar and then a release of those starches that are required. The second thing that's going to happen is that there's the enzymes associated with the carbohydrates and the carbohydrates, and then there are enzymes associated with proteins and the proteins. So in barley, we've got both carbohydrates and proteins, and those proteins are primarily cell wall material. We need a certain amount of enzymes, or I'm sorry, digested proteins, amino acids, for proper yeast health and nutrition. And the brewing practice of using decoction mashing allowed for the proteolytic enzymes, the protein-eating enzymes, to break down the cell wall material and release it. Today, malts are universally, and this goes to England as well, those malts are much better modified. There are higher levels of proteolytic enzymes. There's actually more accessible proteins. And in many cases, what this means is that we break down the proteins into amino acids in such a way that the proteins that would be responsible for forming a head are destroyed. And the amount of amino acid that's presented to the yeast during fermentation is very high. This is an advantage to large brewers who are making beers with high adjunct components. Adjuncts do not bring amino acids or proteins in, and so therefore they want a surplus of it. And for the most part, I find that beers which are decoction mashed with modern malts to be lacking in foam stability, lacking in some character, and can be kind of overloaded if you're making an all malt beer, overloaded with this free amino nitrogen. So I used to brew a lot of decoction mashed beers. I don't do a lot of it now. And that is primarily because of the malts that we're getting. So. Okay, as homebrewers, we don't usually have an access to a malt analysis for a specific base malt we're using. What tools can we use to figure out our best mash schedule? If I'm plagued by chill haze in my pilsners, how do I adjust my step mash schedule to adjust and correct for that while still maintaining good foam stability in the finished beer? Yeah, so chill haze is just simply the interaction between proteins and polyphenols. So proteins are coming forward from the malt, and the polyphenols or tannins are coming both from malt husk and from hop. How you can manage chill haze there's really three ways. One, you could get that beer quite cold, you have the chill haze created, and allow it to stand for a long time. And in German, we know that the word for storage is Lager. So a lager house is a warehouse. And lagered beers are beers that have been stored a long time. And this helps to clarify them both from a yeast and also a chill haze, or this protein polyphenol complex. Secondly, we could remove protein, or thirdly, remove polyphenols. And the way that larger brewers will do that is that you could add components that would either destroy or selectively absorb those materials. So one way to do that, a long time ago, Anheuser-Busch used to do, in their lagering, they would add tannic acid. That tannic acid, those tannins would react with the polyphenols and eventually fall out of solution. There's things like PVPP, which is a plastic, a nylon that's added to beer that can be, can drop it out and be filtered away. Personally, I believe in cold aging for a longer time. Filtration can help to remove that as well. So, and in terms of if you had a malt analysis, what information that would change? Probably not a lot. I mean, you're going to see that the malts that are used are going to have, I guess if you use a very low protein malt, that will help as well. So, because some continental malts will have these lower proteins that could assist. Okay, next question. What kind of malt characteristics to look for to get bigger head and more retention? What enzymatic rests or temperatures promote or work against head retention of the final product? So to get good head retention, there's a few things that you can do. One is to make sure that those proper size proteins are there, and you sort of fractionalize proteins into molecular weight. So like 10 to 12 kilodalton areas where you'd want to be. I think that pretty much if you are using something with less modified proteins, you're going to get better head retention. So a high protein component malt might be wheat malt. So if we put wheat in there, that helps. Carapils is, in effect, under modified barley. that is that brings those larger protein fractions forward and can produce great foam. Things that are foam negative include yeast guts. So good yeast health and removal after it's done will help with foam, better foam. And I really think that foam is like the first quality metric, one of the first quality metrics we use to assess a beer. If we walk up to a bar and we order a beer and they draft the beer, and as they turn and there's this, just voluminous, great rocky foam, you think, in my brain, I'm thinking the brewer used enough of and high quality enough ingredients to produce a foam. If I just had water doesn't form a foam, and so therefore it's a visual indication of beer quality in a way before we've even smelt it, touched it, any of those things. Okay, similar to Carol's question, is there a noticeable difference between floor malted Pilsner or other malt and continental Pilsner malt? Does the specific malting process make much of a difference in the malt flavor profile as the region of its origin or growth? So I think about floor malting as a process where instead of germinating the malt in thick beds that are mechanically turned and are a bunch of air blown through it to manage carbon dioxide generation and release, are in much thinner beds. And it's associated with older malt houses. Now, why those malts, a lot of those malts are quite nice. And I think in some ways it's because there's a lot of care and concern that's put into them. And there's a lot more labor. The overriding, I think that the piece that's most important, though, is probably variety in malting practice. So variety, think about an older malt variety like Maris Otter. I love Maris Otter. It has got a reasonable, what they call a KI or Kobach index, the amount of, when the malt is fully modified, the amount of soluble protein compared to the total protein. And these are really important. So I don't think there's anything magic with floor malting. Just like there's nothing magic with hand mixing, your bread dough. But in general, if I'm taking the time to hand mix my bread dough, I might be paying a lot of attention to it. So there you go. All right. So I understand that reducing coagulable nitrogen too low is a reason that head retention can suffer. Yeah. So coagulable nitrogen, there's a bunch of different analytical measures that one can look at inside of barley malt. Ultimately we start out with a package, if we start out with the barley kernel as a package of husk and embryo and carbohydrate, the starch, and then cell walls that enclose it. And those are primarily formed of protein. And the amount of protein as a percentage varies. So I know that in the United States, if we were to pile on the fertilizer, have a drought year, and use certain varieties which have been adapted to our soils, that we can reach very high protein levels. In contrast, some older varieties which have low percentage of protein naturally occurring and growing conditions which favor low nitrogen end up with, therefore, this fairly low nitrogen package. That's compounded with the malting practice and the variety itself of where where complete is in malting for it. And the analogy I utilize for this is that, if I told you that I had, I have a dog. My dog is 60 pounds. Is my dog overweight? And your first question would be, what variety of dog do you have? Because, if you got a Chihuahua and it's 60 pounds, that's really different than if you got a St. Bernard. So there are some barley varieties that want to have low protein, and when they are fully modified, have low amount of soluble protein. And for me, those malts are certainly better suited for making all malt beer than something which was high both in total protein and percentage of soluble protein. When you break down all that protein, you will have problems with head formation, and so that's kind of a measure of that. Okay, so how can you really understand malt varieties? Could you suggest a practical way to methodically know each malt variety? I don't. I would look at so you could look at. I'm trying to think of where I would find this. I mean, I sort of get some of this data because we look at what they call off kilns, or individual malt varieties, which as they come off the kiln, we can see what sort of where they sit. In general, older English varieties, so think Maris Otter, think Golden Promise, are going to have lower protein and lower Ki or Kolbach indices associated with them. Modern North American varieties, and especially some of the Canadian varieties, can be quite both have high enzymatic content, what we call hot, and also have high protein contents associated with them. So where could I find that? I mean, I wrote about some of that in the malt book, but I would just also talk to other brewers, and I'm certain you could find some of that on the web. I have a question for you. Should I have another beer? Oh yeah.
Yes.
Oh yeah, that was a trick question, and I'm pretty tricky right now.
I'm trying to send you another question, and I'm having trouble. Let's see.
Are you talking?
Okay.
You typing?
I am. I am. There you go.
Yeah. Cheers to everybody out there. Thank you so much for hanging with me again. This is a new experience, kind of like one way shooting arrows in the dark here. Oh, crispy.
What?
Oh, enjoying a hop slam. All right. Well, let's get the party started. All right. Martin, maltsters have many unique names for their products. How prevalent is the use of 6-row barley in the production of malts that aren't specifically labeled as 2-row? So 6-row is largely falling out of use. And one of the resources that I would, cheers, Mark. One of the resources that I would really recommend is if you want to know, if you want to learn about malt, pretty much the smartest guy I know about malt from a brewing standpoint is a guy by the name of Joe Hertrich, Hertich. And Joe was responsible for the raw materials at Anheuser-Busch for many years. I just absolutely love talking to him and listening to him. The Master Brewers Association of the Americas, the MBAA, has a series of podcasts that are out, and you can get them through the Apple Store, wherever you find the podcasts. And Joe Hertrich talks a lot about malt in some of these, and he has such a great sensibility about it. One of the things he addressed was what he called the 6-rowification of 2-row malt. And at one point, there were really two broad classes of barleys, the 6 rows and the 2 rows. And the 6 rows were characterized by high enzymatic content and higher protein. And this really worked well for utilizing with adjunct beer. 2 rows were not that way. And over time in the United States, we've really seen that some of these 2-row genetic material has been bred and rebred so that it's performing a lot like those 6 rows that were originally out there. And so I think it's important to sort of know varieties. It's at one point those were really different, but that has kind of changed around a little bit. Let's see here. I'm just turning Think back here. Okay, so how prevalent is the use of 6-row barley in production of malts? So not a lot of 6-row being used, but the 2-row varieties will vary a little bit. Okay, black malt seems to have a bum rep. Do you think that the rep is a product of poor handling, poor marketing? Are descriptors like ashy, burnt, and acrid, or is it deserved? Full disclosure, Baird's black malt is my favorite roast malt. I like black malt a lot. We make a lot of stouts, so I don't know who's shit talking on black malt, but send them my way and we can talk black malt. I do think that with black malt though that there is the acrid component. Yeah, it does. It is ashy. It is burnt. It is acrid. I don't know if those are adverse qualities to have though. So, yeah, big fan of black malts. Okay, let's see here. Everyone tired of hearing it. All right, cheers. All right, what's next? There is significant variability to the mineral content of malt that is available from the maltster. Brewers can obsess over mineral content of water, but the mineral content of malt seems like a big unknown. For the most part, mineral components don't change a lot in processing from barley to malt. There is. I don't know how much. I haven't really done much work with that. I don't know that. We think about the sort of like the water chemistry components as being driven by water more than anything. We've got the analysis equipment to look at that, and we just have not looked at that in depth. Okay, Jeff Rackert. Love the beers Bell's made with Chevalier. So Chevalier is a malt barley variety. Andrew's Ale. Your opinions on that malt? I really like that. I really like that malt. So Chevalier's super old variety. It was one of the first isolates or selections made. And the way that worked was that there was an English guy walking through a field and noticed a particularly robust looking barley plant, took the seeds from that, and then grew some and grew some and grew some, and pretty soon Chevalier had sort of taken over much of the English growing. Like this was the variety that was grown. Eventually, so this all predates plant breeding, and breeding barley can be pretty problematic. You got to basically emasculate the barley and then dust it with pollen, and it's just kind of a goofy process. That barley breeding and other plant breeding didn't really take off for many years in earnest until about 100 years ago. And prior to that, it was just maybe selections made out in the natural field, and that was one of them. I liked that barley a lot. I think part of it had to do with the malting practice that was associated with it, like how they made it. Is the variety super amazing all into itself? Not particularly, but it's got good characteristics. I liked it. Low yielder. There's a reason why people don't grow it anymore. Probably a lot like the reason they don't grow proto corns that would harvest in the bushels per acre as opposed to the hundreds of bushels per acre. Okay, let's see. I like BIAB. Rumor has it that you can crush grain as fine as possible. What if you used a coffee burr grinder to grind your grain rather than crush? I'm not sure what BIAB is, but certainly there are. Oh, brew in a bag. I see. Yes, you can. I think about a different practice. So we use like a mash tun, lauter tun system, like many brewers do. There is another system that's used for mashing and lautering, which is a mash filter. And when mash filters are used, the grain is ground exceedingly fine. There are a couple of different, there's a couple breweries, more prevalent in Europe than here, but there's a number of breweries in the United States that do utilize mash filters, and they get very high extract recovery. So I think about who's got one. well, Full Sail out in Oregon's got one. And when they are preparing the malt for mashing it, I mean, it is ground to almost a powder. Do I find those beers excessively tannic? I do not. You're trying to hold the grain husk particles out away, separate them away. And in the mash filter, that's occurring. You can louder the thing very quickly. You get it away from there very quickly. So the leaching effect is pretty low. The danger would be of getting those husk components into the wort and then bringing it to the kettle, and it's boiled and it's in contact for a long time, and basically you extract all of that husky, astringent character. How am I hanging in there? 6 more questions? 3 more beers, baby. 3 more beers.
Go for it.
These are probably all going to like yes, no questions. So what's the difference between floor malted and regular malted? Yes. Okay. So the difference between floor and regular is so it's actually floor malting is the old practice. Pneumatic malting didn't start occurring until a little over 100 years ago, and during the germination phase, the grain needs to breathe. The grain exhales or gets rid of carbon dioxide, and it needs to be removed. And so the way that that's managed in a floor malting, and the way you could malt beer at your house or malt at your house, would be to have a thin layer of it, so that as the carbon dioxide created, it's off-gassed and it doesn't smother it. Once you get it into a pretty deep bed, now you have to get this out of there. And so the other type of malting would be considered pneumatic malting. And in pneumatic malting, you're blowing air through it, so the air is removing the carbon dioxide. The difference is that if you think about the amount of space that is required to lay out, tons of malt in 4-inch or 6-inch deep bed is a lot more than if you were in like a 32-inch bed. And pneumatic malting has that. So again, pneumatic malting would have turners in there that sort of break apart the tangled rootlets and turn that malt around. Turn that malt over, and then also the ability to suck that carbon or blow that carbon dioxide out of there. So that's kind of what the difference is. So the malt parvers are at work at Labatt's in London. They use a mash filter 24 hours a day and produce 3 million bottles of Bud Light a day. They got one big, I bet they got a big rice cooker there. Okay, is there any difference between the single mash and the step mash? Absolutely. So within barley, there are a number of different enzymes, and enzymes are sort of the natural engines, molecular engines that break down or catalyze reactions, and they're usually very specific. In malt, there are enzymes that are responsible for breaking down proteins into smaller sections, and fragments of proteins are amino acids. There are enzymes that are responsible for breaking down some gum substances, beta-glucans. There are enzymes that are responsible for breaking down starches into smaller fragments. And there are 2 main enzymes that are these amylolytic or starch breaking enzymes, and this is alpha amylase and beta amylase. So if we broadly looked at the proteolytic enzyme, the ones that break down proteins, the alpha amylase and the beta amylase, each of them have a different optimal temperature. In step mashing, what we're doing is bringing the mash into a state where each of these enzymes is sequentially optimized. Enzymes generally work by, at colder temperatures, they're not working very fast. You raise the temperature up, they're working faster and faster. And then as we raise the temperature past that, they become denatured. So enzymes have a very specific shape to them, and that when we get up to a denaturization point, then that, so if we think about that enzyme as having a shape like this, then it changes. And once we've changed this, the lock no longer, the key no longer fits the lock, and it falls apart. So by bringing it through our various steps, we are optimizing each of these enzymes. With a single step mash, what we're relying on that for efficacy is an ample quantity of all of the enzymes. So we can put it at one temperature, everything kind of does its deal, and then we're done. This is British malts, traditional classic British malts have ample enzyme packages, which are ideally suited for this single temperature mash. Step mash sort of emulates decoction. We go through a number of different temperatures, and we can do it without necessarily boiling the mash to get it up there. We just raise the temperature and raise the temperature. So. Do you have any reference or document for replacement malts with any equivalent? I think about, I don't. I wish I had what company one calls something and company two calls something. I think if you look at some of the analytics, so you could look at something like color within a caramel malt, and they're going to be roughly analogous. So company A's caramel malt that sits at 120 Lovibond is going to be similar to company B's. And I put a caveat on this, is that variety would matter, and also how it's made. So caramel malts can be made in sort of like this heated drum that allows recirculation of air and careful control of moisture. Or some companies will make what they call a kilned caramel. And that is just simply, we're going to raise the temperature up on a traditional flatbed deck kiln and pick up our color that way. Those malts are very different from one another. And I'm not going to pass judgment and say one type is better than the other. You just would need to recognize that they're different. I would think that probably the best reference document is the home brewing community that's out there, and talking about who likes what and what's close to what. So the interweb is your friend. Talking about base malts, the difference between a pale, Vienna, and a Munich is the kind of barley or the kilning process. It's the kilning process. It's the temperature, sort of the maximum temperature the kiln reaches. If I think about the way the kiln program would work, we load in, we start off with barley that's coming in from the field at about 12% moisture. We soak it in water until it reaches about, say, 48% moisture. It goes through the germination process at that high moisture content. And at the end, we're going to dry it down on the kiln. And so we load it on the kiln. We start blowing warm air through there. The moisture content slowly drops away. And at the end of that process, we now start raising the temperature up. The higher we raise it, the more color we get, sort of the more aroma we get, and the more sort of drier, not astringent, but sort of, in that direction you get. For me, the Munich malt the temperature has been raised while there's still a little bit of moisture in there. It gets that lovely kind of biscuity character to it. And the Vienna malt is just like one step beyond that. So a little hotter temperature, a little browner, and a little drier. How does the basic practice of malting in categories play out with other types of grain, particularly wheat, rye, and oats? So wheat, rye, and barley are all fairly closely related. Oats is a little further away. The main difference is that these other grains are naked grains. They do not have a husk. And as such, they tend to release sort of like slimy components out in there and make them particularly sticky and difficult to process in the malt in the malt house. And they also makes it hard to get air through there, so that the maltster needs to pay more attention to each of these, and they are harder to process. But overall, I mean, they're fairly similar. Again, I think they are harder to malt. I personally love some of the different characteristics that you get in them. Obviously, we brew a lot of wheat beer. malted oats are just a great flavor. I think that they're, that's a really nice raw material, like the golden naked oats or something like that. Again, beautiful practice, or beautiful products out there. Yeah, so additional work for the malter. As a production brewery, what do you look for in malt? And do you meet with the barley farmers as the same as hop farmers or the malting houses? What influences your malt sourcing after recipe design? So yeah, we have we're very engaged with our malting partners. We've met with some of the barley farmers, but I was just out over the fall and met with a whole ton of them out in Wyoming. But really, we're looking to the malt house. We're looking for malt outcomes that include things like total protein. They're going to, they need to figure out how to get what we're looking for, and some of that is where they're sourcing from. So if I'm an irrigated Western, highlands, that's some very nice barley that's coming out of there. We do at Bell's. We certainly meet with our malting partners on a regular basis. We have, for the most part, weekly or monthly calls with each of them. We also they come and visit us. We make site visits to them. I think it's really good practice to walk through the malt house, to climb underneath the kilns, to look at their records, to figure out what's happening there. In terms of, we definitely want to talk to them about the varieties that they're going to provide to us. That's very important, because again, it's going to influence the final malt. So, all right, let's see here. What influences your malt sourcing after recipe design? Our malt sourcing is going to be, as our malting partner willing to work with us. If we say we want sort of these varieties and processed these ways, how are they going to be blended? That's what's going to drive us. Absolutely. So. Oh, there's Martin. All right, cool. Yeah, this has been a nice project. Glad to see a bunch of good names out there. All right, we got more questions?
Yes, hang on. It's not cooperating. Hang on.
Doug's like the faithful translator, just like bridging between one-way text and, oh my God.
Here we go.
Okay. Milling, wet and dry. Can you share any differences you have found between the two methods? Yeah. So we have both a wet mill and dry mills at the brewery. And what a wet mill is the grist, or the malt blend first exits as you're getting ready to mash in. It runs through a conditioning chamber, and in the conditioning chamber, and this is hooked onto the top of the specialized mill, is an area that as the barley comes through it, or as the malt comes through it, there's a bunch of hot water pumped in there, and it's in contact with the grain for a couple of minutes before the grain gets to the crushing rollers. And what's happening when that occurs is that, if you think about that malt is just dry, 5% moisture or so. And you put hot water with it, and it starts to suck up the water. And the water is being sucked up into the malt first through the husk. So the husk gets quite wet. And it takes a while for it to get through there. So the endosperm, the chalky middle of the malt, is still dry. That malt then goes through the crushing rollers, and you can set the crushing rollers quite close. And as the husk, as the grain goes through, the husk is now soft and pliable, so it can experience this sharp, hard action of the rolls and retain its shape. It retains its structural integrity. It does not pulverize into little husk bits. That has two advantages. The first advantage is that if we're looking to extract tannins, then we'd want to grind it up really finely. We don't want to extract tannins, and it is not being ground finely because that husk is retaining its shape. The endosperm, the friable inside of the malt, is absolutely pulverized, and that gives great access for enzymes and great access for extract release. What we found, and this was when we put our wet mill in, I gave my great buddy Matt Brynelson over at Firestone Walker a call because they were putting in a similar system like immediately after us, and what we saw is that we got great extract, but we also had an increase in the fermentability of the beers that came out of it. It dried the beer out. The beer would go to a lower finishing gravity afterwards. So we have got at Bell's, we've got a number of different brew houses. We've got a 200-barrel brew house that we use a wet mill with. We have a 50-barrel brew house that we use a dry mill with, and then we have a little 12-barrel pilot brewery that we also have dry milling with. So we'll see some difference between them, and it's interesting to look at the analytical data. The same malt processed through the same malt mashing program, and you get slightly different beers out of it.
Do you want to?
All right. I can't wait to watch this thing when I get a friggin' working computer. It's going to be hilarious.
It's great.
I would hope that you all are just shit talking me right now. And
you're hanging. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh yes, you are shit talking me. Okay, understood, Doug. Thank you. Thank you for the translation. All is klar. All is klar.
So do you see the question? Or over there?
Pointing to me? Have I got something here? Oh, let's see.
No. Oh, the question.
Oh, homebrew talk forums. All right, let's see. Okay, there's a growing interest in low dissolved oxygen in mashing and boiling. Is there anything similar in malting? No, I mean, you need a lot of oxygen in malting. If you think about the grain, we're basically taking, it's interesting that malting barley is the only crop that needs to be sold in a viable state. So if you have corn that's dead, it's still corn, and you can use that, for whatever you're doing corn with. For malt, if we're going to make malt, then that grain needs to be viable. It needs to be in a quiescent state. It needs to be, dormant, but it absolutely needs to be alive. And when we then start to grow the grain, germinate it, it is respiring. It is taking in oxygen and putting out carbon dioxide. And if we were to starve it of oxygen, then we would kill it and we would halt the malting process. Now, there are some cases where you want to develop acidity. So like making a brune malt or a sour malt, something like this, then they'll what they call tent the malt, and it increases the amount of lactic acid bacteria that's growing on there, and therefore makes an acidic compound. But absolutely, you need oxygen in malting, or you end up with a pile of dead putrefying grain. Which, if you wanted to buy some, I'm sure somebody would sell it to you. So, last question: what are your thoughts on low dough brewing, low oxygen on hot side of mash boil? The controversy. So this is something I've talked about in the past, like a long time ago, and this probably predates this conversation by quite a bit. That one's empty. Oh, this one's still got some beer in it. All right. It's interesting that, where oxygen gets in that process, we know that we absolutely need oxygen. At some point, we need to oxygenate work to have good yeast viability, respiration, and all. The problem with getting oxygen in there is that we're also could be creating staling compounds. And I think I have a lot of respect for large industrial brewers that they're able to, go in day after day and make a very, a beer that would show flaws very easily, and they make it incredibly consistently. These are not beers that I want to drink nor brew, but from a technical aspect, I think that they're just fascinating. If you think about a beer like Budweiser, that beer goes through a very interesting process in the brew house. And, there's always been a lot of talk about, hot side aeration. Between wort clarification and cooling, Anheuser-Busch breweries have a device called a stripper. And the stripper is really interesting in that it's like, you think about like a big shell and tube heat exchanger almost, or rather this, there's a bunch of tubes that are all arrayed vertically. And on top of the tubes, there's a pan with holes drilled in it that correspond to those tubes. And at the bottom, there's then a collection point. And so wort is pumped into the top of this thing, and the wort starts to go down through the tubes, and it's clinging to the side of the tube as it goes down. And at the same time, air is being blown up the tube. And as that air is being blown up the tube, it is stripping away, it's volatilizing things like DMS, so that they can remove a lot of DMS without needing to overboil the beer. I think about oxygen control in brewing and packaging, and Anheuser-Busch is really good at that stuff. The piece I don't taste is, in as pale and as light a beer is this thermal degradation or oxidative degradation that we'd be concerned with. Now, does that mean I think you should be bubbling air through your mash? Absolutely not. But it's not the death knell of a beer. We want to have good oxygen control. We want to keep low oxygen through the mashing process, mashing, lautering, boiling. I think that is very important. So, I don't know. That's kind of an answer that you could read that's not clear. Do I think you should splash around your mash or wort? No, I do not. Do I think you need to, seal your kitchen and fill it with nitrogen before you brew? I do not think that either.
Well, John, I know you can't hear me, but let me speak for everybody here that we really appreciate. You're really a trooper. It's super cold up there. You've had to shut down your operation, and we appreciate you going to the trouble to even be on here and really going through this with no Q&A. You just, we really appreciate it. So I'm going to say a few things to close. And again, everybody else in the audience, really appreciate you hanging in there. There will be a recording where you can hear John, which is, of course, the most important part. And we have more webinars we're working on in February. I don't have the schedule on those yet, but I know at least John Palmer promises at least one, and we're working on some other folks. So stay tuned. Again, I appreciate, sorry the audio was a problem, but maybe we can talk John into do another one. So thank you very much. Good night, everybody. John, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Hey, thanks everybody for being there. Again, I apologize. Maybe someday we'll get I'll get a computer that works and we can talk and answer questions. Appreciate all the great feedback. Comments are too kind, and I don't know. Well, good. It's been a good presentation. Cheers, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.